What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically examine apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be looking at Randal Rauser talking about how absurd Jesus mythicism is. And boy, does he have the best arguments ever. Here, why don't you take a look?
You have agnostics like Bart Ehrman. You have atheists like Gerhard Ludemann. None of those people in these fields take Jesus mythicism seriously as a real intellectually viable position.
Oh, God. I mean, what can I say? This is probably one of the worst arguments against mythicism that I've ever come across. If you want to find out how piss poor Randal Rauser's arguments are against Jesus mythicism, then please stay tuned.
In this video, I want to talk briefly about Jesus mythicism. Now, I find that a lot of Christians kind of just jump in and want to interact with Jesus mythicists without taking the first step of setting up just how extraordinarily implausible this view is. In fact, how it really conforms to classic conspiracy thinking. So that's what I want to do in this video.
Oh, okay. Because I haven't been called a conspiracy theorist 9 million times so far. But it's very dishonest to frame the conversation as if mythicists are equal to conspiracy theorists. Namely, the big difference is that conspiracy theorists take a nugget of truth and then they extrapolate on that truth with unsupported conclusions. They don't have evidence to suggest that their conclusions are true. While on the mythicist side, we take a hard look at the evidence and then we ourselves have evidence that actually supports our end conclusions. There's a vast difference from conspiracy theory and mythicism. I honestly expected something better out of Randal Rauser here because he's a seasoned debater and apologist. I wouldn't really expect him to go the conspiracy theory route on this, but I've seen a lot of historicists take this very aggressive approach to the conversation. Why do you have to be so aggressive in your approach? Why do you have to be so dishonest when even engaging in this topic? Because, I mean, this is going to be your advice for Christians everywhere on how to approach the conversation as if we're conspiracy theorists. That's not having an honest conversation about this. Mythicists have academically challenged the consensus and the evidence with which that consensus is based upon. So you have to handle it with the evidence that we have given to support our conclusion that Jesus probably didn't exist.
First thing I want to note is that Jesus mythicists make an initially extraordinary claim, the claim that a person that many historians believe is among the most influential human persons in all history, they claim that he never existed.
Well, what makes him the most influential person? I mean, if he really was the most influential person, you would think that we would have more evidence than we do. But in fact, if you compare the quality of evidence that we have for Jesus to other historical figures, you will notice a large gap in this quality. Mainly that Jesus has such low quality evidence that it definitely calls his existence into question. Whereas other historical figures don't have such ambiguous, vague, and shallow evidence for their existence. He also makes it seem like questioning somebody's historicity is kind of an unheard of thing, when in reality, it's the exact thing that historians do all the time. So I don't know why you're acting like this is some kind of special treatment given to Jesus or some kind of crazy, wild idea that Jesus didn't exist. If he was influential, then we should have better quality evidence and we should have more evidence. But we don't. We have very scant evidence for the historicity of Jesus.
Now, on the face of it, that is a claim that is about as extraordinary as saying that the moon landing actually occurred at a studio in Hollywood rather than on the moon. That's the kind of territory we're into.
You see, Randal has to put us on the conspiracy theory level because for some reason he thinks that historiography gives us 100% confidence in what happened in history, when in fact, if you're an honest historian, you would never go that far. Now, this is compared to the hard sciences, like, whether or not we landed on the moon, whether or not the earth is round, and whether or not vaccines work. Those are common conspiracy theories that exist now, but the context of those is the hard sciences, not historiography. Now, Vi LaBianca has explained why you can't compare historiography to hard sciences, and I'm going to let them do that right now.
I do think that we need to be careful when comparing scientific consensus with academic consensus, especially in terms of historical analysis, right? Because the way we get to information on either end of those things is very different. We don't necessarily use the same rigorous scientific method that we use to determine whether or not evolution is accurate that we do to apply to historical documents, right? There are different ways to analyze where something came from, how old it is, tracing data back to its first source when we can. So there is a level of scientific approach there, but it's not nearly as rigorous or as tested or as replicable as scientific discoveries are. So I understand that, and it makes sense that you'd say, well, I'm not going to go with a fringe scientific theory because it's not supported by the majority of scientists. So why would I go with a fringe historical theory if it's not supported by the majority of historians? So I get that, and that's a very intellectually honest approach. But we have to keep in mind that there is a difference in terms of the weight of the evidence and what the evidence means and whether or not the evidence has even been evaluated.
The hard fact is that we never walk away with the kind of confidence that we regularly find in the hard sciences. Historiography is all about interpretation and what most likely happened. So framing mythicism as a conspiracy theory and comparing it to the hard sciences is in fact a straw man and is something that I really wouldn't expect out of a seasoned debater like Randal Rauser.
Next thing, note that of the scholars who endorse Jesus mythicists in the relevant fields who have terminal degrees, that is PhDs, the relevant fields being sort of ancient history, New Testament studies, classics, less than 1% of scholars in those fields would hold the Jesus mythicist view or really even take it seriously. In fact, I think you could count on one, maybe two hands, the number of individuals who meet those criteria, such as Richard Carrier, Raphael Latester, Robert Price.
Well, this would be an appeal to popularity. Just because mythicism isn't popular among any certain group doesn't mean that it's not true in its conclusion. Just to give you a comparative example, back in the early 20th century, we thought that Abraham, Moses, Noah, all of the patriarchs of the Pentateuch were real historical figures, until we started investigating the question of whether or not they actually existed. And then over a long period of time, the consensus flipped and came to the conclusion that they didn't exist. Now, when the idea of Moses not existing or Abraham not existing first came up, it was definitely a minority view. But as more people started looking into the question of whether or not they were historical, the consensus over time flipped and changed. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen with mythicism, but I sure do hope that it does happen with mythicism, because I don't think that the evidence actually supports the final conclusion that Jesus definitely existed in history. So for Randal Rauser to frame this particular discussion on the basis that it's fringe or that it's a minority and thus should not be taken seriously, as in the case with conspiracy theories, is just very disingenuous and dishonest of him.
Next, note that of those scholars who have actually published peer-reviewed books that have passed muster with other academics and been vetted by them, you have, I think, only two books. Books published by Richard Carrier and Raphael Latester.
I don't see why this makes a difference. Raphael Lataster's book came to the conclusion of a Jesus agnosticism as far as whether or not he existed, while Carrier's book is definitely has a mythicist conclusion. So I don't understand why the fact that there's only two academically peer-reviewed books written about this subject really matters as to whether or not it's true. I mean, you understand, Randall, that using your particular logic here, that a majority of New Testament scholars and apologists and experts in the current field that we're discussing would also agree that God exists and that Jesus rose from the dead. So, if you're an atheist listening to this and thinking that, yeah, mythicism, that's a conspiracy theory, well then, you not believing in God means that you're a conspiracy theorist according to Randall's logic here. If you don't think that Jesus is the Son of God, you also are a conspiracy theorist to Randal Rauser. Third, If you don't think that Jesus rose from the dead, you are also a conspiracy theorist. So tell me, how valuable is this argument when you can apply it to every single position that an atheist would have on the historicity of the Bible?
Next thing, note that each one of those individuals is an outspoken atheist activist who is openly hostile toward Christianity, regularly engages in debates with Christians. That should tell you something as well.
I'm sorry, what is this supposed to tell me? I mean, you realize that in the atheist community, mythicism is still a minority view because most atheists out there feel like it's not a very important topic to cover, which I agree. In the larger context of the conversation over religion in America or in the world in general, whether or not Jesus existed is a pretty minimal issue, and it's really only handled by those wanting to discuss the topic of history and the Bible. So I understand atheists not really jumping on board with mythicism when it doesn't really matter concerning whether or not Jesus is a divine being or came to earth and died for our sins. I get that why most atheists don't subscribe to mythicism. But Randal here is talking about how atheism is somehow a contributor to a mythicist position on whether or not Jesus existed. I guess he doesn't realize that experts like Thomas Brody, who are Christian and are also a mythicist, exist. So it really doesn't matter whether or not we're atheists or Christians. I think that you can be a Christian and also think that Jesus was a mythological figure through and through. But you can most definitely be an atheist and think that Jesus was a historical figure, and that is actually the majority opinion in the atheist community. So how exactly does this matter again?
So let's pull back now and change that context. Imagine that we're talking about human-induced climate change, and the only climatologists with PhDs in climatology who deny human-induced climate change, there's about 5 of them, let's say, and they all happen to be on the payroll of big oil companies like Exxon and Shell. How skeptical would you be of those 5 scholars and their views? I mean, I think you'd be very skeptical, and rightly so. You don't deny or reject the consensus of 99% of scholars and plus, and go with this tiny minority with clear vested interests for just no reason at all.
Well, again, there's no vested interests, especially me, which I can't directly speak for Carrier or anybody else, but I know for me, whether or not Jesus existed really has no bearing on my atheism. It's not like if Jesus existed, I'm going to immediately become a Christian. That's just ridiculous. But also, I'd like to point out the controversy surrounding lead in like every product known to man that occurred in the 60s and the 70s. The majority of experts believed that lead was not contributing to the harmful effects they were seeing in the environment. In fact, oil companies were paying scientists to do studies in order to reinforce that lead was not causing adverse effects on the environment. But then there was one person that came forward, one person that started doing a controversial study on lead in the environment, and that consensus in the scientific community changed over time. So you appealing to authority or appealing to popularity, which you seem to be going back and forth between the two, never works out in history. Now, should the consensus, should the majority be based on quality evidence and quality reasoning? Yes, it should. But also within science, there exists a mechanism for us to overturn the consensus by saying, oh no, you're wrong. Here's contradictory evidence. And that's exactly what the scientists did for lead-based products. He overturned the consensus over a long period of time. At first, it was not accepted by the general scientific community. But over the years, as people started looking into it more and more, they finally figured out that it was causing a rise in the lead concentration in the environment, and that was very harmful to us as humans and the environment in general. So I'm still failing to see the value of this argument that you're presenting, Randal.
Now, the last thing I want to note is that Jesus mythicists do what conspiracy theorists generally do, which is they then provide some really lame reasons just to kind of marginalize, reject, ignore the entire overwhelming consensus of scholarship on a particular issue.
Well, no, that's not what conspiracy theorists do. How much interaction have you had with actual conspiracy theorists? Because what conspiracy theorists do is they provide ad hoc explanations as to why the consensus is wrong or as to why conclusions are not true. They provide ad hoc reasoning, but that's not what we find here. You may find the evidence to be lame. You may find the reasoning to be lame, but that does not mean that it's actually lame, because that's very subjective language that you're using there. Just because you're not impressed by the evidence, it does not mean that that argument is false.
For example, Jesus Mythicists will often make sweeping claims about how, well, all of those other scholars, they're all just corrupted by religion, dogma, pressured by religious institutions to toe the theological line on particular issues.
Well, I mean, that's not my primary argument when I go to it. Like, I don't try to impose any kind of, feelings or emotions on the apologists that argue for a historical Jesus. I more or less try to attack the actual arguments that they present and not their motivation for presenting those arguments. It seems rather stupid, and I don't really see a lot of mythicists actually doing that. Now, they might bring them up as a way to explain why certain bad arguments are convincing to Christians. I mean, dogma is a very hard thing to let go of, and it can cause people to make very bad decisions based on that dogma. But that is not the reason why we disagree with the consensus or the majority in this instance. We disagree with them because the evidence doesn't actually support the conclusion. You're totally strawmanning the mythicist community right now. Also, I'd like to point out that this exact same argument could be used against any atheist out there that denies God existing, at least in a definite sense, or denies that Jesus was the Son of God, or denies that Jesus resurrected from the dead.
You actually have to take a look, however, at the diversity of these fields, ancient history, New Testament studies, to appreciate just how ridiculous that claim is. The field is full of a diversity of theological perspectives. So you have some conservative scholars, let's say Richard Bauckham, or maybe new N.T. Wright is relatively conservative. We also have sort of more liberal, let's say Catholic scholar like Luke Timothy Johnson. You have Jewish scholars like Mark Nanos. You have agnostics like Bart Ehrman. You have atheists like Gerhard Ludemann. None of those people in these fields take Jesus mythicism seriously as a real intellectually viable position.
Well, that's really sad, because they should, because it's an academic argument that's been made in the field of academics. So why wouldn't you take it seriously? Why wouldn't you write journal article after journal article disproving every single point that Richard Carrier has brought up or Raphael Lataster has brought up? Why wouldn't you do that? If it's so easily refuted, why in this video have you chosen to attack mythicism on the basis that it is a minority opinion rather than attacking the evidence that we present against the consensus? Seems to me like maybe your evidence is really, really weak. And I get that you've got a wide range of people with bad arguments for the historicity of Jesus, but it doesn't matter how many people from however many different backgrounds use the same bad arguments. They're still bad arguments because they're bad arguments.
As well, the institutions for which these people teach. I mean, there are some institutions that are relatively conservative in terms of their doctrinal perspectives, some conservative seminaries, some Bible colleges. But I think the vast majority, in my impression, of institutions that employ these scholars are like public universities. They are institutions that don't impose any sort of theological obligations on these individuals.
I really don't think that's true. If any of you have read David Fitzgerald's most recent trilogy of books concerning mythicism, in his first book, he elaborates on a study that he conducted on these theological institutions that issue these degrees as well as employ these historical scholars. A majority of them did require that the people that taught there and everybody that attended the school had to sign statements of faith. They had to believe in it. Now, David Fitzgerald also produced a number of different scholars out there that went against the grain of the particular institution that they were teaching at, and they were summarily fired or let go. One of the more famous ones is Mike Licona. He doubted the physical resurrection of people when Jesus died and had the zombie horde that, attacked Jerusalem after Jesus died. He doubted that was historical, and he was summarily fired for it. Another scholar is P. claimed that scripture was divinely inspired and inerrant. Seems okay, right? But with a caveat, it was produced by fallible humans. It is also contradictory, and it's part myth, and is similar to other older ancient texts. He lost his job for that one. Christopher Rolson lost his tenured position because he criticized the marginalization of women in the Bible. Bruce Waltke lost his job because he spoke out in favor of not denying evolution. Tom Thompson established the ahistoricity of the biblical patriarchs. He suffered years of constant and unwavering attempts to destroy his career. And there's many more. I could go through them, but you see my point here. The point is that these institutions that control the narrative about biblical history are doing just that, controlling what we understand about biblical history. The only way any of it is going to actually come out is if somebody outside of those teaching institutions takes a look at the evidence, and that's what Richard Carrier has done, Raphael Lataster has done, and others.
So to dismiss the 99% plus of scholars and the position they take relative to the existence of Jesus because they are somehow corrupted by some shadowy theological magisterium that is imposing doctrine on them. This is, again, back into the realm of just bald conspiracy theorization.
Well, if it is a conspiracy theory that these theological institutions are controlling the narrative about Christianity, then why do we have so many instances of these theological institutions doing exactly that? And this is not the first time that Christianity has been able to control its own narrative. During the Middle Ages and for hundreds of years, Christians were the ones in control of what documents were preserved. And that resulted in many documents being lost to time and lost in other ways. So is it really a conspiracy theory to think that Christians are controlling the narrative about their own religion? I would agree with you if we didn't have evidence of them doing just that. But this is not an ad hoc explanation. This is an explanation that definitely has evidence behind it.
And so now we're back again on the soundstage of Burbank, California, claiming that, in fact, the moon landing happened here rather than on the moon. Now, there's this popular saying of many atheists like to toss around, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Generally speaking, I'm not a big fan of that claim because I think really all it ends up saying in many cases is your evidence isn't extraordinary enough for me, so it's not good.
Well, I would think that what's meant by that particular phrase is that you need a substantial amount of evidence, or evidence that can't be explained in some other kind of way. Naturally, you have to have this supernatural kind of evidence, I guess, evidence for the supernatural in the context in which that is used in. But I feel like you're going to use it for this particular argument as well.
But nonetheless, there is some wisdom in that little maxim that it is kind of pointing out that when you have an initially extraordinary claim, you do have to look for some good evidence to consider that claim.
Yeah, and we have. Richard Carrier's book is a really, really big fucking book, and it's got a lot of evidence in it. In fact, there's so much that he had to write a book previous to that establishing a correct method in order to do historiography. So he's got two books technically on this particular issue of historiography surrounding the Bible, but also you got Raphael Lataster's book, which is also pretty thick. It's actually targeted at universities. That's how it's priced, at least. So we do have good evidence. My question is, why are you not actually arguing against the evidence here? It kind of seems to me like this is something that more people should look into. If Christians are so worried about it that they have to argue from authority or from popularity in order to suggest that people shouldn't look into it, that should raise a red flag for you.
And I will just say this, that just as denial of the moon landing is an extraordinary claim, so denial of the historical existence of Jesus is an extraordinary claim. Feel free then to get into the weeds debating with Jesus mythicists if you want. Just appreciate that you are really engaging with a position that is pretty much an extraordinary conspiracy theory held by a tiny minority of activist atheist scholars and a lot of YouTubers as well.
Well, and I happen to be one of those YouTubers. I'm not a scholar in it, but I have read all of the scholarship on this particular topic and I'm still a mythicist. And it doesn't matter how widely held mythicism is. That doesn't actually affect the truth value of mythicism. And I really hope, Randall, that we can one day have a discussion on the historicity of Jesus, because I would really love to know what your arguments are against the mythicist arguments, and not consensus. Do away with the idea of consensus in this particular context. Let's actually engage in the evidence. And I really want to do that with you one day. Hopefully we can do that. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. That's all of Randall's video. If you will, please let me know what you think down below. Do you think that he's got a solid argument for comparing mythicism to conspiracy theory? Or do you think that mythicism really lacks the core values of a conspiracy theory like I do? Hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like these kinds of videos. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens!